Gary adjusted his cap, his breath fogging the cool northern air. The mist hung low over the golf course, shrouding the distant trees in a ghostly veil. He had been teeing off at sunrise for nearly 20 years, and today was no exception. There was something about the solitude of the early morning that drew him to this spot, the crisp air filling his lungs as he prepared for another round. However, today was different. Today he wasn't alone. "Mind if I join you?" asked a voice behind him. Gary turned to see a young man standing there, golf clubs in hand. He looked out of place against the backdrop of the ancient mist-covered fairway. Gary frowned, not used to having company at this hour, but nodded. "Sure, why not?" "I'm Gary," he said, extending a hand. "Jacob," the young man replied with a calm smile, shaking it. The two set off, Gary leading the way. He had never seen Jacob before, but something about him felt familiar. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound the soft crunch of their footsteps on the dew-covered grass. "Do you play often?" Gary asked, trying to break the ice. Jacob chuckled softly. "Not as often as I'd like, but I enjoy being on the course." Gary nodded, satisfied with the answer. He didn't notice that Jacob never actually hit a golf ball, though he carried a full set of clubs. Instead, Jacob seemed content to watch as Gary played, offering quiet encouragement and listening intently as Gary recounted stories of his best games. "This hole," Gary said, pointing to the fourth green, "was where I made my first hole-in-one. It was a beauty, straight and true." Jacob smiled, his calm demeanor never wavering. "I bet it was a sight to see," he said. As they reached the fifth hole, a melancholy silence settled over Gary. He stared at the flag fluttering gently in the morning breeze, his thoughts drifting to bygone days spent on this very green. "Do you miss her?" Jacob asked quietly, as if sensing Gary's shift in mood. Gary sighed. "Yeah, sometimes. There was a time when I couldn't imagine life without her. But life has a way of changing. This was where I asked her to be my wife, right behind green 5. A single tear welled up in Gary's eye. Jacob nodded knowingly. "It's never easy letting go of something you love." Gary glanced at Jacob, puzzled. "I apologize for bringing that up. We're here to enjoy a relaxing round of golf, not to dwell on a weary man's sorrow." Jacob smiled faintly. "We all have our stories." The pair continued their walk, the mist beginning to swirl as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Gary found himself opening up more to Jacob, sharing tales not just of his golfing triumphs, but of his family, his career, the ups and downs that had shaped his life. By the time they reached the 9th hole, Gary felt a strange but comforting bond with the enigmatic young man. As he prepared to take his swing, he glanced at Jacob and said, "Thank you for joining me today. It's been interesting." As they continued, Gary couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Jacob's presence was both comforting and unsettling. He seemed to know just what to say to keep Gary talking, reliving his finest moments on the course and in life. Yet the young man never swung his clubs, never teed off, never putted. By the time they reached the 15th hole, Gary was feeling more winded than usual. The mist seemed thicker, swirling around them like a living thing. Jacob's calm presence was a steadying force, but Gary's thoughts were beginning to race. "You know," Gary said, leaning on his club for support, "I've never seen anyone else out here at this hour. It's always just me." Jacob nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "Maybe it's time for a change," he suggested gently. They reached the 16th fairway, and Gary felt a sudden, overwhelming fatigue. He stumbled, breath coming in short gasps. Jacob was at his side in an instant, guiding him to a nearby bench. "Sit down, Gary." "Take a moment," Jacob said, his voice soothing. Gary sank onto the bench, the mist swirling thicker around them. He looked into Jacob's eyes and saw something there that he hadn't noticed before. A depth, a timelessness that seemed to stretch beyond the here and now. "Who are you?" Gary asked, his voice a whisper. Jacob took a deep breath, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I'm here to help you, Gary. To guide you." Understanding dawned in Gary's eyes. He looked around at the mist-covered course, the familiar landscape suddenly feeling distant and otherworldly. "My last round," he murmured, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I should have known." Jacob nodded, his expression kind. "It's been a good one, hasn't it?" Gary nodded, feeling a strange peace settle over him. He closed his eyes, the sounds of the course fading into the background as the mist enveloped him. The sun finally pierced through the mist, casting a warm glow over the deserted course. Gary's clubs lay exactly where he'd left them, a silent testament to a lifetime of early morning rounds. The only trace of Jacob was the extra set of footprints in the dew beside Gary's. Later that day, those who came to the course might have sensed a lingering serenity, a whisper of a final round well played. And so, Gary's last game came to an end, guided by an unseen hand, into the next great adventure.